I'd always look through to, when you're doing your due diligence on your purchase, what does the meeting minutes say for the last 2 years? What does the look through to the financials to see, do they have a healthy reserve fund built up? Look at where they're spending their money. Is there any sort of big wastage or big areas? If you came to retire and needed to sell the property completely, there's much more likelihood that a house or a villa is going to hold its value compared to a high density apartment.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here's your host, Jared Mann.
G'day and welcome to another episode of Perth Property Insider. Today I'm bringing you the most interesting questions getting asked on the Perth Property Investment Facebook group. If you're not already a member, head over, search Perth Property Investment on Facebook, join in the conversations, post any questions and help others out with your opinions. And I thought I'd bring together a collective of questions that all have a bit of a common vein, so you'll see those as it unfolds. And then later in the episode, I'm going to do a deep dive on Cockburn Central. And even if you don't have a property there or you're thinking about buying there, I think it'll be useful for you to see some of the elements of our trifecta review for the suburb and the area that we use on our buyer's agency side when we're assessing a suburb and area's potential for growth over the short term, the medium term and long term, as well as the rentability, which needs to be paid a lot more attention to at the moment with some markets across Perth cooling and being harder to find tenants to rent. So let's take it away, shall we? First question was thoughts on buying a 2-bedroom unit as our second investment property. Lots of people saying to stay away from Strata. So back in episode 177, I covered how does the performance of houses and units compare. And I was suggesting at that time that it was a good time. This is about a year ago now, that people should look at purchasing a unit if they're priced out of houses, and that I thought the gap between apartments, units and townhouses to houses would close, and that units represented really great value with rental yields being historically very high and the difference between prices of houses and units being very large. So that gap has closed a bit, but houses have continued to surge ahead as well. And units, even though they've had a bit of a comeback, I still think they represent really great value for this stage of the cycle. When you've got, say, less than $650 to spend, I'd definitely be looking at some kind of unit. When you've got $700 to spend, you're on the borderline there where you can get a very well-located unit with a lot of positives and very few trade-offs. When you're at sort of $750 plus, you'd try to get into a house, but you've got a lot more trade-offs. When you're sort of $800, $850 plus, you can get into more reasonable houses, and that's how prices are sort of unfolding at the moment. So it can also be the case that when you're creating your overall strategic plan, as I've done so for clients, we can see that their situation, both borrowing capacity wise and what they've got in available cash flow, can warrant leaning more towards a unit because the yields are better. If you buy well and don't purchase one with really high strata fees that cut into the yield, your net yield should still be better than buying a house. And that's also going to mean that you can afford to hold it, and the bank's going to look at you better in the eyes of serviceability, and that might mean that you can get into your next property sooner. And with units being relatively undervalued, they should have some good growth over the next 1 to 2 years and help you get that equity to leapfrog forward with. So what are some of the considerations? Because I think everyone just paints units or strata all with the same brush. It's worth understanding that there is different types of strata. There's the high density, more modern apartments that I generally suggest that you stay away from. There's the older complexes that are more of what I'd call a unit, where they have a larger land component and they can be varying in size. So I'd probably tend to stay away from the really high density ones too. And then you're getting into smaller unit groups, older complexes where they still have a large land component. Generally, the lesser the size of the group, the less chance for issues that you're going to have, the less chance for politics, and you don't have big upkeeps with lifts and other high cost items that could need replacing. So then when we look at other types of strata, we've got single level villas is what we'd call it, where they can either be attached and have attached roofs, attached walls. So that attachment can be there, and then or they can be detached or unattached where they're completely separate. So an older villas, it's very rare for them to be detached, and just because it would have taken up a lot more space to build them. So I wouldn't necessarily expect to find older villas that are completely detached, or certainly not many of them. So just make sure you're not looking for unicorns when you go looking for these things. Now, it's ideal if you can get into a group of, say, less than seven, less than five's even better. I think when you've got five or more, you do need to have a 10-year maintenance plan, and the group needs to elect not to have a strata manager if that being the case. I'd always look through to, when you're doing your due diligence on your purchase, what does the meeting minutes say for the last 2 years? What does the look through to the financials to see, do they have a healthy reserve fund built up? Look at where they're spending their money. Is there any sort of big wastage or big areas? Look at what that quarterly strata fee equates out to being. For a two-bedroom unit like this person's looking at purchasing, you really wouldn't want to be spending more than 600 a quarter. That's going to work out to $50 a week. So very important to still have a strata fee, because that's going to maintaining the grounds, paying for professional management, maintaining and putting into the reserve fund. In many cases, that also covers your building insurance that you'd otherwise have to pay. And keep in mind that you still have a lot of these expenses with a house, except it's not wrapped up in a pretty thing called a house. We have it as a strata fee. It's not wrapped up in one fee. It's spread across many fees with the house. So people often aren't really comparing apples with apples when they're working out the net yield that they're left with, if that makes sense. So why do a lot of people say stay away from strata? Well, you don't want to have big expenses coming up, so you can look in the 10-year maintenance plan to try to avoid that. You look in the meeting minutes to see if any of them are being discussed. You don't want to have politics in the group with issues that are going on, and you don't have as much control potentially over those. You have to leave it to the strata manager to resolve. You want to have a good strata manager. You don't want to see any complaints in the meeting minutes about the strata manager. So I think if you can keep your group size down, keep your strata fee reasonable, and ensure that when you go through the group, you can see that the common property is presenting well, being looked after, and isn't dragging down the value of each of the units, because that's going to make it hard to rent and hard to sell later when you come to doing those things, especially in a cooler market. Then I would have no qualms about purchasing into a unit of some kind, and I would be favoring the lower density, and I'd stay away from the high density, new, shiny apartments that you might be most drawn to. Check out episode 177 for some more on that, comparisons on actual returns, and I think that would be a worthy one to go back and listen to in any case, even if you've heard it. Hope that helps. Next question, and I've kind of chosen one that relates into our first question. Seeking advice. Currently have a mortgage with over a 3x2 apartment in Coburn. Value is 580 to 600. We owe 365. The strata is 1200 per quarter, so pretty high strata fees there. Looking at a small house, looking to change over to a small house, 3x2 or 2x2, which would require borrowing an additional 100 to 150. So that tells me they're potentially looking at purchasing something at 700, 750. So right on that borderline between some other kind of unit, a villa and a house. So still possible to buy a house at that 750 sort of mark and pick up stuff for 700, but you got trade-offs. That would still only give me a property in an average location. Yes. They're 54, they earn 115K per annum, no other debt. My concern with keeping the apartment is the strata and how this might look in 10 to 15 years' time as the building ages. I'm running out of time to wait 5 years so need to decide in the next 12 months at least. So, what I did to answer this question, and I already provided them their answer on the Facebook group, but I thought it'd be really worth running through and repeating my thinking for everyone else. I ended up putting their situation into game plans, which is our modeling tool that we use for creating strategic plans. And I needed to use that to use some serious computing power to model things out. I never like to just throw off an off the cuff answer without having this stats and facts to back it up, especially when we're really data driven in all of our thinking around here. So I think with that type of apartment in a high density, newer group, you're most likely going to be looking at a 2 to 3% average annual growth rate over the long term. Yes, apartments have bounced back in Cockburn Central and many of the other high density apartment sort of areas, but that's because they also were down in the gutter for some time and really fell in price. And so they're a lot more volatile type property when you look back at where they've been at for prices. They can be susceptible to crashing when the market does cool off. So that for me is a big concern. So, your 2 to 3%, it's on the low side of a return. Those strata fees are a big concern to me. As I mentioned, I'd be looking at sort of a $600 per week or less with a 3x2 apartment that they've got maybe a bit more, 700, 800 possible, but it's definitely cutting in there to the overall net yield you're left with. So if you did change over, you'd be targeting at least a 4.5 to 5% average annual growth rate on a villa or house. And so I wanted to model this out because, as I've discussed in previous episodes, there's people think that chasing the cycles and changing over properties is a good idea. And I've modeled out that you'd need to achieve a 14% average return ongoingly to offset changeover costs, assuming that you had growth for a 4-year period and then a flat 4-year period after that in an 8-year sort of cycle. And then any less than a 14% return ongoingly basically resulted in you being far better off if you just buy and held the property. So it's a similar thing in that you're getting a lower overall return to stay in the apartment. But if you change to a higher return in the villa or house, which is going to be around nearly double the actual growth rate, you're going to have all those changeover costs to pay and you're going to have capital gains tax to pay. So that eats into the return. It takes a while to recoup that back and make the changeover worthwhile. And that's why I really needed to model it out at her based on her situation, based on her income, based on how long she had left in her time horizon. And so that's what I've done. The conclusions might surprise you. When I looked out at things over a 10-year period, it was actually fairly similar in terms of overall return, and that's counting the income that you get from the property as well as the potential growth there. Based on those sort of growth rates, I used a 3% return for the apartment that she's in now. I used a 5% return for the house, and I found it very similar in terms of overall return across the 10-year period. I also looked at a 15-year period, and at that point, it definitely starts to sway more towards the house or villa versus the high-density apartment that she's in now, equating to around an extra 100,000 in equity benefit, equity in growth if you changed over to that new, better performing asset. So definitely the longer you held it, when you extended beyond 15 years, the case for owning a house or villa was going to be much more better than the apartment. But returns aside, I think there'll be a lot less risk in changing over to a villa house versus this high density apartment. And if the strata fees keep going up beyond what I've allowed for in my projection, I just allowed for a 2.5% increase in line with inflation. But if they go up beyond that, which it's probably highly likely to, especially the older the complex gets, this could really cut into that overall return and the risk of owning that asset. Plus, I did mention the risk of this market being a lot more volatile. So if you came to retire and needed to sell the property completely, there's much more likelihood that a house or a villa is going to hold its value compared to a high density apartment. If you had to try to sell when we were down in the gutter most recently, this kind of property, you would have taken an absolute bath. So I think it is worth changing over, all things considered, and it is effort. So that's why I'm always reluctant to go through all those changeover costs and the effort unless you're going to get a better overall return. So hopefully that helps with the decision. It's then just a case of choosing the best possible timing and doing it with an overall strategy so that you can get the best price possible. Feel free to reach out and I can give you an appraisal and discuss how I would do that in terms of its presentation, timing to market, how we create competition, how we price the property strategically, and how I would go about negotiating the best possible price and bringing all my experience to doing that. Hopefully that helps and gives people a bit of insight that it's not always clear cut and you definitely need the power of modeling sometimes to work out the best thing to do. And that's why I get really deep in the weeds with these strategic plans that I create for people and give people clarity on what should be done. Next question. I'm early 40s. I've paid off half my mortgage and have a chunk of savings. I need to find the right financial person to give advice about the smartest way for me to purchase investment property. Any suggestions from personal experience? Now, I brought this one up because I found it really interesting that people on the Facebook group were chiming in and giving finance brokers details. And I wanted to sort of explain the different roles that you can go to for input from professionals. So a finance brokers are absolutely essential to the process. Really, their role is helping you work out how much you can borrow, put a strategy together for your structuring of those loans, and to sort of help you look forward in line with, maximizing your borrowing potential and seeking out the best overall loans for you in terms of policy and rate, and preferably keeping things flexible so that nothing's cross-collateralized and you've got the freedom to keep growing your portfolio as you expand. What I wouldn't be looking for them to do is give you financial advice or property selection advice or any advice in terms of your overall, strategy specifically relating to property or what type of assets you're buying. That's not their place. Likewise, your accountant, which some other people mentioned, great for minimizing your tax, great for some structuring input. Some of them are licensed financial planners, so can advise you on that area. Others cross the line deeply and sell house and land packages and other off-the-plan investment properties. And, you have to really wonder, who you're getting your advice from with all of that. And it is really difficult because a lot of the other financial planners in the landscape out there, they understand superannuation, they understand shares, they understand insurance and minimizing risk, but the majority of them don't understand property. So it's very rare to have someone that is asset agnostic, if you like, and not biased to any one asset. That's why I get Stuart Wames on the show from Pro Solutions quite a bit, because he also understands property. But it's difficult when a lot of the financial planners that do understand property and do have that higher caliber and expertise like Stuart, they also, only usually work with higher net worth people. So that's why I still thought and want to get Stuart involved in the podcast, because I'm trying to bring his information that would otherwise be inaccessible to the widest possible listeners of our podcast that we can. But it doesn't, unfortunately, it means that a lot of our listeners may not be in a position yet to be able to use him or take advantage of that. And so I do have some other potential financial planner that I won't mention on air, but if you do want to reach out and you're in that sort of middle sort of income group, middle wealth sort of group, not yet high net worth, then I can suggest someone else in that sort of space. But it is difficult to find someone that understands property and can bring this whole plan together. And ultimately, that's why we launched our strategic portfolio planning service, because You need modeling, you need real world experience. We just focus on the everything that goes within the property box. That's you plan for your home and how that's all comes together. You plan for your investments and, what type of, where do you add something that's more growth focused, more rental yield focused? How does that impact your future decisions? How does that impact the equity that you're likely to gain and how well you can afford it? And you want to plan in your holidays, your car upgrades, and your other significant expenses so that you're not feeling stressed about those things when they come up. So that's why we created our strategic portfolio plan, and we've tried to price it at a level that everyone can afford. And having seen the difference that it can make for people, the clarity that it can give, and then how we work with people ongoingly each year to review where are you at with your goals? Have they changed? Where are you at with your overall situation? Can we progress the plan faster, or do we need to put a pause on it for a while? I think it's an essential thing to have at the core of what you're doing. So good question. It's hard to find the right people. How people then usually work with our strategic plans is we focus on the property side. They then take it away, fold it within their overall plan and have their financial planner create the plan for their super, the plan for their, other share assets and more liquid assets. And they have them plan out their wills and insurances and reduce their overall risk. And we just stick to the property plan in the middle of it. So hopefully that gives you a greater insight as to the options and how we fit in.
Just real quick before we continue on with the episode, are you getting my email updates yet? If you're not, you're missing out on our suburb intelligence reports, which we tailor and prepare for your individual suburbs of interest, showing advanced stats and insights. Must get onto those. And I also send out exclusive invitations to our events, including webinars, sundowners, and workshops. So if you're not getting those, head on over to investorsedge.com.au/join and make sure you're receiving my email updates.
Next question. How much of an issue is selling an investment property with a tenant in the current market? Looking to sell July, but I have a lease until May 2026. Feeling frustrated as lease renewal was only meant to be for 6 months, but was done for 12 months in error. Good tenants, but places very cluttered and won't present well at open inspections. Now, I discuss this type of decision a lot with our clients all the time. A tenant can be living in the property, they can be very cluttered, they can still be paying rent and otherwise a good tenant, but not ideal when it comes for presentation to sell. So very often we're vacating the tenant, we're staging the property, we're presenting it at its very best so that we can get that emotional price from the market. And the other benefit of having a property that's no more than 2 months out from the end of its lease or vacant is that we can sell to home buyers. And in the market at the moment, home buyers are 70 to 80% of the market in most areas. So we don't want to cut them off. And the trouble about selling a property off market, and in this case, I've got a really great database. I've got 26 buyers agents on there. I could get this person an offer off market in 1 to 2 weeks. And it might seem like a really good offer, but the difficult thing to know without going to the wider open market, we don't know if that's a really good offer, or we don't know if we could have gotten better because we haven't received all the feedback from all the other buyers in the market. We also haven't been able to create competition and push the price up. So ultimately, you're definitely costing yourself by limiting the property just to investors. So even if you, for instance, we put it to my off-market database of buyers agents and other investors, then we put it on the market as well and got all the on-market investors. We're still only then dealing with investors, aren't we? So if we'd had the 70 or 80% rest of the market, they could have competed for it. We could have gotten all the feedback from them to know that we've gotten the very best price possible. And then you could have accepted it with confidence. The downside here is, yes, we could sell it, but it's going to cost you. And there's no two ways about that. What we can look to do, which I do, when this happens, and I've just done it with a current tenant of ours. The owner was on offered them a 2-year lease because they wanted security with having a baby. We always advise our owners, don't go signing a lease any longer than a year, even if everyone's certain, just because situations change. Things have changed for the owner. They now want to sell. We've got a year and a half left on the lease. So we've chatted to the tenant. We've negotiated with them. We've agreed to pay them out and come to an agreement to terminate the lease. They're going to move out. Then we're going to present it at its best, stage the property, and sell. So not ideal for the tenants to move out. They've agreed on their own accord and they're getting some compensation to move. So it's still found a way for it to work for everyone. And now the owner's going to have the freedom to go and present it at its best, get the very best price possible. That's what I'd be looking to do. You can pay the tenant sort of any amount of money and still have it worthwhile up to a point. But typically we're paying, anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 to cover moving costs and the effort involved. A lot of tenants can be reluctant depending on their situation. But now that there's a few more rental properties out there, vacancy rates are easing. And in the case of our rent roll, we would try to help them move to one of our other properties. And in this case, with the tenants, we sent them all the properties we had available. We can give them a good rental reference if they have been good and just help with the whole process so that things go smoothly. So hopefully that gives you some options there and you can understand the trade-offs of selling off market. And it really is going to be best if we can get an agreement with your tenant and then look to go on market and get the very best price possible. Awesome. So that's all of our questions from the Perth Property Investment Facebook group. Hopefully that will add some value to you and make sense. Just my opinion as well. I'm not the be all and end all. Don't know everything, but that's what I would suggest in each of those situations. Now, let's do our deep dive on Cockburn Central. Not sure if you've heard of Coburn Central, but it's a suburb that is on the Kwinana Freeway. There's Belia Drive that it runs off, and it's on the western side of Belia Drive. We've got South Lake in the north, Belia in the south. And it's got a population of 1,521 people. It's 19 kilometres from the Perth CBD, so not that far out. Cockburn Central is one of our satellite cities. So we've got Joondalup as a satellite city in the north. We've got Cockburn Central as a satellite city in the south, as the freeway runs in each direction. And so there's a lot of infrastructure that is built up around there. And you can imagine that on the face of it, there's probably a lot of property investment marketers that say, hey, it's got a train station, it's got all this infrastructure, it has to make a good investment. And a lot of people have probably been sold into on that basis. But today I'm going to take a deep dive into what do I think in terms of does it make a good investment over the short, medium and long term. And we're going to look at both the units and the houses. And I'm going to look at what is predicted for growth. I'm going to look at the fundamentals of the area. We'll take a dive into demand side, supply side, and the rental market there. So I think it should help you see how I analyze things. And this is only a small sort of part of the overall things that we look at in our trifecta review when we review the suburb and the area. And of course, the last thing that we review is the property, which I'm not going to go into a specific property here. I'm more just going to look at the suburb and give you some insights. So population here, I mentioned 1521. It has been, steadily increasing. So over the last 10 years, the population has more than doubled. So that really goes to show that a lot of extra housing's been created just in a decade. When we look at the top 3 industries of employment, hospitals was the top one, cafes and restaurants, and then iron ore mining. So hospitals was fairly obvious. Why? Because we've got Fiona Stanley in Coburn there of the hospital, and cafes and restaurants. Well, we've got Cockburn Central area, the shopping area, which is, I think has got the biggest shops in the southern hemisphere, or at least it was for a while there. I've only continued to expand and add more shops in there. So a lot of people usually like to live close to their places of employment. So probably no surprise that those are the top 2 industries of employment. And when we look at a couple of the fundamentals, the percentage of properties that are rented has also had a sharp increase over the 10 years. So in 2011, it was 45%, which would already be considered high. It's now 65%. So I don't know where that stands in overall rankings of top suburbs by percentage of renters, but it's got to be up there. 65% is a huge percentage of renters. So that initially is a big red flag for me because it's going to mean that the market's a lot more volatile. People aren't going to be as proud about where they live, what they do to improve their properties. It's going to make it harder to rent a property when the market is down. It's going to mean that overall, you really want to be buying into areas that don't have anywhere near as high a percentage of renters, just because it ultimately impacts how volatile the suburb's going to be. So that was a bit of a red flag before we even got into some of the rest of things. But let's take a look at the recent growth that's gone on. When we look at houses at the moment, the typical house price is 835,000 and the unit price is 480. The 3-month change in prices, so houses have had a 6.37% change in 3 months, so still very healthy, on par for a 24% for the year. When we look at what it's done over the last year, it's grown by 34%, so pretty reasonable growth. Over the last 3 years, it's done 54%, and the 10-year average is 4.71%. So not setting the world on fire over the last 10 years. That's because it's coming off of such a low base and did go back far and has had to come a long way back up to correct what had dropped. So the average annual growth rate for houses is 4.71%, which is still not setting the world on fire. Median rent at the moment, $700 per week, which is a 4.36% yield. So about what you'd expect for a house rental, a house yield. When we look through at the units, the 3-month change is 11.63%. 12-month change was 20%. So it's actually on par there for 44% growth if it continued in the same rate that it has done over the last 3 months. So you can see the houses is slowing in growth with a 6% annualized to 24%, and we compare that to 34% over the last year. Units has increasing in its rate of growth, on track for a 44% compared to a 20% over the last year. Hopefully those numbers didn't hurt your head, but needless to say, the rate of growth for units is increasing and looks to be, compared to houses, which is slowing down. The overall 10-year average for units, though, is only 1.91%. And that's why I suggest that long-term averages for these types of high-density driven markets is 2 to 3%. So it's still going to do some more growth before this cycle ends. It's probably going to end up at the top end of that sort of 3% 10-year average. Pretty on the mark with that. So median rent is $580 per week, and that is a whopping 6.28% yield, which is really large. But as we saw in the case of that other question being asked, you really need to look through to what are the strata fees and what are you left with. But that's pretty important. Now, let's take a look at what is predicted for growth. I'm just going to go into my other data prediction tool. And when we look at houses, the capital growth predicted for the next year is 14% for houses and 11% for units. So that's the high end of growth that is predicted for each. So still very encouraging for what growth could be ahead there, especially over the short term of the next year. So that's good for anyone that does own a property in there, and this person that is looking to make their changeover. When we get into the nitty gritty with them, we'd sort of weigh up, well, what areas are you looking to buy in? And we'd be trying to at least get areas that are going to have a stronger predicted growth. And when you're getting it on a higher price point, that can be advantageous too. And if you're getting it for longer, as in not just the next year, but the medium term as well, then that, and over the longer term, then that's going to land you better off than the averages that we're modeling out in game plans in the planning software that I was using. So keep in mind the planning software was just based on averages. When we actually come to do things, We can strategically choose the timing. We can try to outperform the averages, and that's where we can add a lot of value as a buyer's agent and with our strategic planning and strategic sales. And I thought it worth mention on that. People are occasionally commenting on our YouTube videos or saying, "Oh, you're a buyer's agent and a sales agent. What could go wrong?" Inferring that there's a conflict of interest. We've always found that we never buy properties for a client when we're representing them that we're selling, and we definitely can't under our licensing. So there's never a conflict there. When we're selling a property, we're trying to get the best price possible for them. When we're acting as their buyer's agent, we're going out into the market, finding the best price, the best property that's likely to outperform and purchasing it at the best price possible. So there's never a conflict there. What clients enjoy is that holistic service. So for many people, we're helping them sell their home and buy their next home or an investment property, and they can have one trusted advisor for both of those things to manage all the overlap and the juggling act to make all those things really smooth. And we can fit that to an overall strategic plan so we all know what we're doing and have clarity on where we're heading and what we're trying to achieve and the most optimal way to do that. So that's how it all fits together. And I just wanted to mention it while we're on there. Now, when we look at some of the fundamentals that are going to affect growth over the medium and long term, worth mentioning that the ERSAD, which is the relative economic advantage and disadvantage for the area, is a 7. So there's reasonable levels of income compared to prices there at the moment and the capacity for people to pay more. We usually look for this to be a score of 3 or greater. The affordability index is another factor we look at, and we usually want this to be less than a 40 in the index score, and houses are at a 38.21. So they're approaching the upper end of their sort of affordable range at the moment. So that's going to start affecting growth potentially over the medium term. When we look at units, their affordability index is 23.81, and I just mentioned 40 is the sort of cutoff level when affordability starts getting to be an issue. So there's potentially a lot more upside for people to afford paying higher prices for units in the area, and that gap will still need to close between units and houses. As I've mentioned, that gap has gotten wider, but started to improve, but still big gap across the board, across the whole of Perth, not just in Cockburn Central. When we look at the other factor here of hold period, so the average holding for a house is 8.52 years. We usually like it to be more than 7 years. The units is 7.66, so reasonable holding period, which means that there's going to be less supply sort of coming on. I suspect part of the reason for that higher holding period is because prices were so volatile there. A lot of people that have wanted to get out couldn't, and they've had to hold longer than they potentially wanted to. So you really do need to understand the stats and look through to what's actually happening. So the other factor I mentioned previously was the percentage of rentals, which being really high would put me off as well. So now let's take a look at some of the other things that come into our decision on how much potential an area's got. I want to have a look at the demand side. When we look at the days on market at the moment, houses are selling in 23 days. So that is fairly high compared to other houses in across Perth. It's trending sideways at the moment, so still holding at that sort of level. It's increased by a couple of days over the last month, but still trending sideways. So that is still looking reasonably good for growth ahead for houses that, stuff's still selling quite quickly. When we look at the units days on market, that trend is very steeply down still, and it's at 12 days on market for units. And when I think about the first home buyer changes that are coming from both federal parties, both Labor and the coalition, that's going to really kick in demand in units even stronger. And so I think that's going to be across the board, across the whole of Perth, for anything sub 700 is going to go absolutely nuts come May onwards. So this would benefit from that too in the shorter term. So looking good as far as the demand and days on market for units, still continuing to decline. When we look at the demand from potential buyer demand, online search interest is still looking very good and trending in an upward steep trend. So high online demand. So that's all looking good. When we take a look now at the supply side, so we're not always just interested in the single month. I'm looking at the trend of which way a suburb's going. So overall listings has been trending down, which is very positive. Trend is still overall down, so that is good news for both the sale for the house market and units. So that should help to keep pressure on prices increasing over the short term. Now, finally, I'm going to take a look at the vacancy rate, which is 1.28%. There's only 3 vacancies online at the moment, which is nuts tight. And that's going to keep pressure on rental prices increasing, which is good news for the short term. The other thing I forgot to mention on the supply side equation is stock on market as a percentage. I mentioned the number of sale listings. That's still very tight, trending down as well, consistent with the number of properties listed for sale. So overall, I think the prospects are pretty reasonable for growth in the short term at Cockburn Central. But longer term and medium to long term, I wouldn't be choosing it as an area to invest just because of how volatile it has been and how high the percentage of rentals is. And houses wise, it is approaching its affordability index. So over the medium term, that's going to likely have an impact and slow down the rate of growth for houses. Units wise, I think it's going to benefit strongly from all the upcoming changes and surge that ahead to close the gap on houses. That's going to happen across the whole of Perth, not just in Coburn Central. I think if I'd always be looking through to what the strata fee is you're paying and what sort of your net rental yield is. And if you're paying a high fee, then for all the reasons I mentioned, it may be worth considering a changeover. Now, keep in mind as well, when I modeled things out for our person that asked the question, I was only looking at changing over to a property that's only slightly higher in price, not that 100 to 150K higher, but a better overall investment. If you modeled this out to changing over to something that might be at 800 plus K, if we can seek out a growth rate of 5.5%, 6%, then it's going to well and truly sway in favor of changing over and not continuing to hold a subpar asset. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your situation and whether you get out of something. But there is a lot of cost in the changeover, so worth considering what's best for you. Well, hopefully that all makes sense and you've gotten good value out of today's episode. If you have, like and share it with others. I always appreciate people posting a review. And if you do have any other suburbs of interest that you want me to do a deep dive on coming up, feel free to post a comment or reply to one of my emails and I'll put it on my list of future ones to check out and bring to you. So thanks for tuning in and catch you on the next one. Bye.
Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.